Husband left a note on the kitchen counter. 4 words, then a name I recognized. Gone to Whistler. Enjoy, Dad. That was it. No explanation, no apology, not even a question mark at the end, as though leaving your wife alone with your estranged father on Christmas Eve was simply a logistical arrangement, the kind you leave for a house-sitter. I stood in the doorway of the house my husband had grown up in, my overnight bag still on my shoulder, a foil pan of butter tarts in my hands, homemade. Because his mother had always loved them, and I still cared about things like that, even then. The lights weren't on. The heat was down so low I could see my breath, and then I heard it. A slow, rhythmic creak from the back of the house. I followed the sound down the hallway, past the family photos I'd never been invited to be in, past the closed door of the bedroom where my mother-in-law had slept before she moved to Arizona with her boyfriend 6 months ago. The creak was coming from the sunroom. I pushed open the door and found my father-in-law in a wheelchair by the window, watching the snow come down over the frozen lake, a quilt over his lap and a mostly empty mug of tea going cold on the side table. He turned when he heard me. His eyes were sharper than I expected. My husband had always described him as fading, forgetful, difficult, not worth the drive out to Muskoka. He barely recognizes anyone anymore, he told me more than once. It's like visiting a stranger. But the man looking at me from that wheelchair was not a stranger, and his eyes had nothing foggy about them. You must be Lydia, he said. Colin mentioned you might come. He said he'd be here too. A pause. I suppose he found something better to do. I set the butter tarts on the windowsill. I'm sorry, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know he wasn't going to be here. My father-in-law. I'd only ever called him that in my head because my husband never bothered to introduce us properly. Nodded slowly. No, he said. I don't imagine you did. His name was Arthur. He was 74 years old and he was dying. I didn't know that yet. I found out about 20 minutes later when I went looking for something to make for dinner and found the fridge containing half a liter of milk, some margarine, and a container of store-bought soup that had expired 11 days ago. There was a tight medication schedule on the counter, the kind the pharmacy prints out. I glanced at it without meaning to and saw the words palliative care at the top and the date it had been prepared, which was the same week in October that my husband had told me his father was doing better, actually, so you don't need to worry about him. I sat down at the kitchen table. My husband had known. He'd known for months and he'd driven out here to Muskoka with a woman named Renee. I would find out her name later from Instagram. Same as the last time I discovered something I wasn't supposed to know, and he'd left his dying father alone in a cold house on Christmas Eve with an expired container of soup and a note that said, "Enjoy, Dad," like he was a gift. Arthur appeared in the doorway, moving the wheelchair himself with more effort than it should have taken. He looked at my face, then at the medication schedule in my hand. "Ah," he said. "You found that. Does Colin know?" I asked. Meaning, does he know how sick you are? Meaning, does he know this isn't just forgetting names and mixing up dates? He was at the oncologist appointment, Arthur said, in October. Him and his mother, both. His mother, who was in Arizona. I thought about the last time I'd seen my mother-in-law at Thanksgiving, how she'd smiled at me with that particular smile she had, the one that looked like warmth but never quite reached her eyes, and said how glad she was Colin had found someone so steady. I'd thought it was a compliment. Standing in that kitchen, I began to wonder. I asked Arthur if he'd eaten today. He said he'd had toast at noon. It was nearly 6 in the evening. I put my coat back on and drove to the food land in town, which was still open, mercifully, and I bought what I could find: a small pork tenderloin, potatoes, a bag of frozen green beans, a dozen eggs for the morning, and a box of red rose tea because it was the only kind I'd seen in his cupboard. On the way back, I called my husband. Voicemail. I texted. No reply. I opened Instagram and searched his name and found a photo posted 2 hours earlier. Colin and Renee at the base of a ski hill, helmets on, his arm around her shoulders. The caption said, "Finally," with a snowflake emoji. His sister had liked it. I sat in the parking lot of the food land for 3 minutes watching snow settle on my windshield. Then I drove back to the house, made dinner, and set the table for 2. Arthur ate slowly. Between bites, he told me about the lake in summer. how he taught Colin to fish there, how the dock had needed replacing for years, but he'd kept patching it because the original wood was from a tree that had come down in a storm the year his wife was pregnant with Colin. And he'd cut it himself and dried it in the barn, and it meant something, even if nobody else thought it did. Colin thinks sentimentality is weakness, Arthur said. Not with bitterness, just as a fact. His mother raised him to believe that. I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. After dinner, I washed up, and Arthur watched from the doorway with that particular stillness that sick people sometimes have, like they're conserving something. He asked me why I'd come if I hadn't known he'd be here alone. I told him the truth, that Colin had said it was a family Christmas, that his parents were expecting us, that I'd spent 2 weeks planning what to bring. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he does that. Makes things sound one way and lets them become another. In the morning, I woke early and made eggs and toast and brought Arthur his medications, working from the printed schedule the pharmacy had provided. There were 7 different prescriptions. Some of them were for pain. The bottles were less full than they should have been, based on the refill dates I noticed, because I'm the kind of person who notices things like that, who reads the fine print, who double-checks. I thought it was a flaw. Colin had certainly implied as much. I asked Arthur about it carefully. He looked at his hands. Colin picks up my prescriptions, he said. Has been since September, when I stopped driving. He says the extended release ones are expensive. Says the pharmacist suggested I could get by on less. A pause. But the pharmacist didn't say that. I called to check, back in November. I set the orange bottles back on the counter in a careful row. Arthur, I said, he's been giving you partial doses. Arthur didn't look surprised. He looked tired. There's a power of attorney, he said. His mother and Colin, jointly. Over my finances, my medical decisions, everything. I signed it 3 years ago before I understood what I was signing. My own fault. I thought of the medication bottles. I thought of the expired soup and the cold house and the number my husband hadn't answered. I thought of the word palliative on that printed sheet. How long? I asked. Meaning, how long do you have? The oncologist said 3 to 5 months, he said. In October. It's December now. The snow was still coming down outside the window. The lake was completely white. I called in to work that day. I work in healthcare administration in Toronto, and I had the week off already, but I needed to tell someone where I was. Then I sat down with Arthur and listened. He talked for 3 hours. He told me about the carpentry business he'd built from nothing, about the house in Muskoka he'd bought in 1987 for $240,000 and renovated room by room over 20 years. He told me about his first wife, Colin's father's mother, who had died young, and about how he'd been alone for a long time before meeting Colin's mother, and how he'd tried so hard with Colin, tried to be the father figure the boy seemed to need. Paid for his private school and his ski trips and his university and his first car, and how somewhere along the way, Colin had decided that what Arthur had was simply owed to him, not given. He told me this without drama, the way you'd describe the weather. At some point, he said, I want to show you something, and led me, slowly, the chair bumping over the doorframe, to his study, which was lined with bookshelves and smelled of cedar. Behind a framed survey map of the property, the kind that comes rolled in a tube, he pulled out a metal file box. Inside was a different picture than the one I'd been shown of Arthur's life. The house I was sitting in was worth, conservatively, $1.3 million, a Muskoka waterfront property that had appreciated year over year for 2 decades. There was also a rental property in Barrie, a self-directed RRSP account worth over $400,000, and a small portfolio of dividend stocks that Arthur had been quietly tending since the 90s. Colin and his mother had access to a joint checking account and a non-registered savings account. They did not have access to any of this. They think the house is everything, Arthur said. They've been spending down the joint account for 3 years, calling it home care costs. I have receipts if you want to see them. Home care that never arrived. Invoices for services that were never provided. I looked at the file box. Why are you showing me this? He looked at me for a long moment. Because you drove 3.5 hours in December to bring my son home-baked butter tarts, he said. And when you found him gone, you still went to the grocery store. I didn't have an answer for that. I need help, Arthur said simply. Not with the house, not with the money. I need help getting things done correctly before I can't do them anymore. I have a lawyer in Bari, Helen Osei. She's been my solicitor for 20 years, but I can't drive, and Colin intercepts my mail, and I've been afraid to make phone calls because he installed an application on this phone that forwards my calls. He pointed to a second phone, a simple flip phone, sitting at the back of a desk drawer. He doesn't know about that one. We called Helen Osei from the flip phone that afternoon, sitting at the dining room table while snow fell on the lake outside. She was in her office, working through the holiday week, and she knew Arthur's voice immediately. When he explained the situation, there was a brief silence on her end. I've been waiting for this call, Arthur, she said. For about a year, honestly. Tell me where to start. She came on the 27th, 2 days later. A small, precise woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a canvas tote bag full of documents. She had clearly prepared. She had also clearly been worried. We worked through it over 2 days. A new power of attorney, properly witnessed, transferring authority to Helen herself as a professional substitute decision maker, with me named as a secondary contact for medical decisions. A new will. A codicil to the existing will that explicitly detailed the reasons for changes to the beneficiaries, the underfilled medications, the misappropriated home care funds, the intercepted mail, and named these not as suspicions but as documented fact. Arthur had been keeping records too, in a spiral notebook he'd kept in the same desk drawer as the flip phone. You've been building a case, I said. One evening when Helen had gone back to her hotel and Arthur and I were sitting by the window with tea. I've been trying to understand what was happening to me, he said. When you get old and people start making decisions for you, there's a moment where you realize they've stopped asking. You don't always recognize it until it's been happening for a while. He looked out at the dark lake. I'm glad I recognized it in time to do something about it, he said. That night, I called my best friend Josie, who's a paralegal and the person I call when I don't know what else to do. I stood in the little mudroom off the kitchen and talked to her for 45 minutes, very quietly, while Arthur slept. She told me I wasn't crazy. She told me what I'd found was serious. She told me to document everything, and I said, I've already started. I had, in fact, photographed every prescription bottle with timestamps. I'd written down what Arthur had told me and had him sign each page. I'd found the home care invoices in the filing cabinet, 11 months of billing from a personal support worker agency, totaling just under $20,000 for a worker Arthur had never met and whose name he did not recognize. On New Year's Eve, 4 days after Helen had visited, Arthur asked me to help him do something he'd been meaning to do for a long time. He had a bottle of 2001 Inniskillen ice wine in the back of the pantry, put away the year his carpentry business had its best year on record. He and his first wife had bought 2 bottles to mark the occasion. He'd opened one at the time. The second one he'd been saving for something worthy. I think this qualifies, he said. I found 2 decent wine glasses in the back of a cupboard. The good crystal had been taken, Arthur noted, by his ex when she moved out, and I poured us each a small amount. The wine was extraordinary, sweet and cold and very particular, the way good things are. We sat by the window and watched the neighbors' fireworks come up over the tree line. Arthur told me about New Year's Eve's past, about his first wife dancing in the kitchen, about the year Colin was 7 and had been allowed to stay up past midnight for the first time and had cried from sheer exhaustion by 11:30. He laughed, telling that story. It was a real laugh. At midnight, he raised his glass. To clarity, he said. To clarity, I said. He died on the 8th of January, quietly, in the night. I had been sleeping in the guest room down the hall, and when I got up at 6 to check on him, he was already gone. The room was peaceful. He had arranged his things, his books, his notebooks, his file box, with an almost deliberate neatness, as though he'd known. I sat with him for a while before I called anyone. I called Josie first, and then Helen, and then the number the palliative care team had given us for exactly this situation. I did not call my husband. He arrived at noon with his mother, both of them tanned from their respective trips. His mother in a new coat I didn't recognize. They came through the door talking about the drive, about the 400 being terrible even in January, and then they saw me sitting in the living room and stopped. Where is he? Colin said. He passed away this morning. I said. Peacefully, in his sleep. The silence was different than I expected. Not grief, exactly. Something more like recalculation. His mother spoke first. We should call the estate lawyer. There are things that need to be handled quickly. I looked at her. Helen Osei has already been in touch with the court, I said. The new will was filed in December. A different kind of silence. Colin's voice went very careful and controlled. What new will? The one Arthur made in late December, I said, with Helen present and 2 independent witnesses and a physician's note confirming his capacity at the time of signing. He was on palliative medication, his mother said immediately. He wasn't competent to. Helen anticipated that, I said. The physician's assessment was specific and thorough. Arthur's cognitive function was not affected by his pain management protocol. Helen's had this kind of will challenged before. She knows how to make them stand. Colin had gone very pale. He sat down on the arm of the chair nearest the door, like he wasn't sure he was staying. The house, he said. The estate is in trust, I said. The terms are in the documentation Helen will share with you. A portion will go to the Carpenters' Benevolent Society. Arthur chose that himself, and the remainder has been designated according to his wishes. What I didn't say yet, what Helen had advised me to let the documentation speak to, was the rest. The investigation she had already initiated with the Ontario Public Guardian and Trustee, based on the invoices and the medication records, the fact that the home care company whose invoices Arthur had been paying turned out to have a registered director whose name was very familiar to anyone who had looked at the joint account statements. I didn't need to say it. Colin's face said he already understood. You manipulated a dying man, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. It sounded like something rehearsed for a different room. I stood up. I brought him butter tarts, I said, and I filled his prescriptions correctly, and I sat with him while he died. I picked up my bag from the chair. You can say what you need to say to Helen. His mother moved to block the doorway. She was still trying, still calculating. You have no idea what you've walked into, she said. This family, I know exactly what I walked into, I said. A cold house. A man who hadn't had a proper meal in days, and a medication schedule that hadn't been followed in 2 months. I have the photographs. Helen has the photographs. The public guardian's office has the photographs. She stepped aside. I walked out of that house in Muskoka and stood on the porch for a moment in the January cold, looking at the lake. It had that blue-gray color that frozen water gets in the flat winter light, and the dock was still out there, still patched. The original boards holding after all these years. On the drive back to Toronto, I pulled over once, somewhere south of Barrie, and cried for a while. Not for what I'd lost. I knew by then that the marriage had been over before I understood it was over. But for Arthur, who had spent 12 years in a family that saw him as a transaction and who had needed someone to bring him peaches, or in this case, butter tarts, and simply sit with him long enough to hear what he was actually saying. The ice wine had been extraordinary. I thought about that. I thought about him laughing at the story of Colin crying at midnight because he was 7 and couldn't stay awake. 2 months later, Helen called. The estate was settled. The public guardian's investigation had concluded with a referral to the Crown for a review of the home care billing. Not my battle to fight, but one Arthur had made possible by keeping records in a spiral notebook in his desk drawer. I had enough to start over. I used some of it to rent a studio, a real one, with north-facing light, which I'd always wanted, and I started taking photography clients again, the work I'd stopped doing when Colin suggested it wasn't worth my time. I still have the ice wine bottle on my shelf, just the empty one, a reminder that some things are worth saving for the right moment, and that sometimes the right moment arrives unexpected in a cold house in Muskoka, with someone you'd never met before and will never forget. I still think about that bottle of ice wine sometimes, how Arthur had kept it for over 20 years, waiting for a moment that felt worth it, and how, in the end, that moment turned out to be a quiet New Year's Eve with a daughter-in-law he'd only known for a week, watching fireworks come up over a frozen lake in Muskoka. There's something in that which I keep coming back to, not as a lesson exactly, more like a thing I know now that I didn't know before. What happened to Arthur didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most quiet injustices do, gradually, through small decisions that each seemed reasonable on their own. A prescription picked up a day late, a home care invoice that nobody questioned, a power of attorney signed before he fully understood what signing it meant. Each thing alone was explainable. Together, they added up to a man being slowly erased from his own life by people who had decided he was more valuable as an inheritance than as a person. What I keep thinking is, Arthur knew. He'd known for a long time. He had the flip phone, he had the spiral notebook, he had 20 years of relationship with Helen Osei and the presence of mind to keep records when he couldn't trust anyone around him to tell the truth. That kind of clarity, held on to through illness and isolation and the particular loneliness of being old in a family that has stopped listening to you, that takes something real. It takes a kind of intelligence that isn't about being clever. It's about paying attention even when it's painful. It's about refusing to let your own story be rewritten by people with a financial interest in the ending. I think about the version of that Christmas where I drove back to Toronto when I found the note, where I called Colin, left a message, told myself it wasn't my problem. It would have been so easy. I was angry enough. I had every reason to make his mess his own. But I went to the Foodland instead, and I made dinner. And I sat down and listened to a man talk about a dock he'd built from a tree that fell down the year his son was born. I'm not saying I'm a good person. I think I just happened to be someone who hadn't yet learned to stop caring, and Arthur happened to be someone who still deserved to be cared for. Those two things lined up on a December evening, and everything followed from that. What I've learned, what I think I'll carry for a long time, is that doing the right thing when it costs you nothing isn't really doing the right thing. It's just convenience. The real version of it shows up when you're cold and hungry and angry and the person who should have been there isn't, and you still go to the grocery store, you still ask if he's eaten. You still sit with him at midnight and raise a glass to clarity. Arthur built a life with his hands. He kept records in a notebook. He trusted a lawyer he'd known for 20 years over people who shared his blood. He held on long enough for the right moment to arrive. And when I drove away from that house in January, I understood something about how lives actually change. Not through dramatic gestures, but through small, honest choices, made one at a time, even when nobody is watching. The ice wine was extraordinary. I think about that every time I open the studio in the morning and the north light comes through the window. It was worth saving for.